Good evening, everybody. So happy that you all came out and braved this rain to come hear our speaker tonight. I thought about this the other day that, over the years we've had quite a few people who have grown up in the church here at Margaret Street and kind of go on into ministry, whether it be going back a couple of years to Tom Baxley or Nick Bartell, and last week we got to hear Josh Holloway. Well, this week we have the privilege and honor to hear Jack Webb. Jack is a graduate of Faulkner University. He graduated with a degree in business administration, and he also studied youth and family ministry. Jack is going to be getting married October 1st to his wife-to-be, Courtney Barnes, and I know he's looking forward to that and the life that they'll start together. He is currently the youth minister at Scenic Hills Church of Christ, and we're just excited to welcome him home and hear his message. So, Jack, looking forward to your message.
Good evening. He said for all the young people to be dismissed, and it felt kind of weird not being dismissed. It didn't feel right. But here I am, and time really does fly whenever you get out of high school, because I never thought that this would be me. But here I am, and I'm very thankful to be back here at Margaret Street, to be able to speak to you guys, to be able to bring a message to you guys as a part of your summer series. I'm thankful for Troy and Chris for reaching out to invite me to be a part of this. So I hope that I prepared a message that you guys will enjoy and benefit from. So whenever I was about 8 or 9 years old, I had a dream. Is my thing up? Not yet. There it is. I had a dream that my brother Nick and I were at the beach. And my brother and I were walking on the pier and, just doing your typical thing, just walking down the pier, looking at the water and everything. And next thing I know, my brother has fallen off the pier. And meanwhile, let me preface this by saying the pier that is in my dream is the pier at Quietwater Beach. And so my brother falls off this pier, and then the next thing I know, I'm telling him, like, you gotta go to shore, as if he probably couldn't just stand up. But you telling him to go to shore, that he needs to get out of the water, that this is not good. And then I look in the water and I see something coming towards him. And I'm like, this is not good. You got to swim. And next thing I know, it's the biggest shark that I've ever seen in my life is coming at my brother. And this shark is like the megalodon, and that it is in Quietwater Beach. I promise you that this shark is coming and going to eat my brother. And then the next thing I know, as I'm telling him, swim, the last thing that he does is swim. He's just like, doing what my brother would typically do, which is the opposite of what you tell him to do. And then he's gone, just like that. There's no more brother. And I'm like, well, this is not good. Well, at the time, my brother and I shared a room. And the way we shared a room is we had bunk beds. So I was at the top bunk, he was at the bottom. And so I'm like, well, I woke up from this dream. I was like, I need to check on him. I need to see if he's all right. So I'm bending over my top bunk, looking down to see if my brother's down there. And then as I'm checking to see if my brother is alive, the next thing I realize is that I'm on the ground, and then my dad comes in to check to see if I'm indeed the one who is alive. And I'm sitting there terrified that I just lost my brother, and then I throw myself out of the top bunk. And I tell this story to say that I had a dream involving my brother, and my brother in a not so good state. If I were to go tell my brother that dream happened and that this is prophecy or whatever, he would probably not be too pleased to hear that. Well, in Genesis chapter 37, we know of a person named Joseph. Joseph has a couple dreams involving his brothers. They were dreams where his brothers were bowing down to him, praising him. And we know that Joseph is the second youngest of 12 brothers who come from Jacob or Israel. And so Joseph is being bowed down to by his brothers, most of them being older brothers. I mean, how do you think that would simply make them feel? They're like, well, we don't like the fact that this guy, our younger brother, is telling us that we are going to be bowing down to him in his dreams. I probably want to make them happy. But Joseph is this typical young, intelligent, skilled dreamer. He's well liked by his father. I mean, he looks good all while doing it. We know that he's an attractive guy, and we know that he's good at the things that he does. And he's just this typical 17-year-old whose father tells him he's good at everything, right? I mean, he's arrogant, he's prideful, he thinks that he is going to have this, and he makes sure to let all of his brothers know that, of course. But Joseph goes on, we know, to be sold into slavery by his brothers, and his brothers tell their father that he has obviously been killed. And then in Genesis 39, a couple chapters later, Joseph becomes a servant in Egypt in the house of Potiphar. And what do you think that this experience would have done to Joseph? Again, remember, Joseph is this guy who we described as being young, intelligent, a dreamer, a person who's attractive, a person who's well-liked by his father. He's gotten all kinds of praise. And then he goes on to become a servant in the house of Potiphar. I think that this experience would have simply humbled Joseph to the point of, I had it all. I was doing pretty good, but wow, it's just like that. Man, maybe I do deserve this. At this point, I've now become a servant. And so in verse 2 of chapter 39, it says, "The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man, and he was in the house of his Egyptian master." And we see that the Lord was with Joseph, and he was even a well-liked servant. Imagine that. This guy who had it all, he was doing pretty good, and then he becomes a servant, so he's quickly humbled, but just like that, he's doing pretty good again. He's still a servant, but he's a well-liked servant. And we know that he's given some privileges and some freedoms as a servant in this house. We know that he has some things that probably most servants, most slaves would not have. He has some benefits to what he's doing, some freedoms, some luxuries that most people would not have because, he becomes a well-liked servant. He has a good relationship in this house. But then we know that Joseph also goes on to be falsely accused and then later sent to prison. And so Joseph, again, he's been shoved down, but he kind of works his way back up. And he's like, well, if I'm going to be a servant, at least I'm going to be a good servant. But then he gets pushed back down, and now he's in prison. And it's like, well, as if my life couldn't get worse, now I am in prison. But in verse 21, it says, "But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison." Humility, again, brings the Lord into Joseph's life. Whenever he's made it up, this chain of command, or up this successful ladder, it's not too long and he gets pushed back down. He gets pushed down into becoming a servant. He gets pushed down into becoming a prisoner. And it's a humility that at both times it says that the Lord was with Joseph. So in a time of worry, it is in a time of worry whenever we see God show up. So Joseph's obedience also affects the life of those around him. Joseph has been humbled, but he also has this sense of obedience. And that is one that affects everyone around him. In the house of Potiphar and in prison. In verse 5 it says, from the time that he had made him overseer in his house and over all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was on all that he had, and in house and field. And then again, once he gets sent to prison, in verse 23 it says, the keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's charge, because the Lord was with him. And whatever he did, the Lord made it succeed. So Joseph's obedience was radiant, that it spread to those around him. Again, in Potiphar's house, the Lord was blessing Potiphar's house because he was blessing Joseph. And the Lord was blessing the prison because he was blessing Joseph. And that was all because of the humility that came from, I think that came from him being humbled by being a servant and by becoming a prisoner. So I asked, do we believe that God was with Joseph? Now you're like, what do you mean, do we believe that God was with Joseph? Well, of course I believe that God was with Joseph. That's something that we just read. We read in chapter 39 of Genesis that God was with Joseph. The Lord was with him. But do we truly believe that the Lord was present in Joseph's life, and that it was not just affecting Joseph, but it was affecting the whole entire house of Potiphar, and that it was not just affecting Joseph, and the Lord was not just with Joseph, but the Lord was in the prison working with Joseph in the prison? And we say, well, of course we believe that. But what did it take? It took humility. It took humility for Joseph to say, I am a servant. I have become a servant, and I have become a prisoner. And, maybe I thought that I had it all. I had this sense of pride or arrogance, but I had to be humbled. And then it also took obedience. Obedience for him to be obedient to the Lord, for him to obey the Lord, for him to do things that are pleasing to the Lord. And so to see that God was with Joseph, it took Joseph's humility and it took Joseph's obedience. It took for him to say that this is his life, not mine. I'm doing this for the Lord, not for me. Whereas what? We saw the typical 17-year-old Joseph who was doing things for himself. He's doing things to make himself look good, to make himself probably get all the jokes, for him to get all the girls, or to get all the praise from his father, or whatever it may have been. Just the typical, I want to look good. This life is about me. But it took for Joseph to say, this is his life, not mine. So it took Joseph becoming a servant of man to become a servant of the Lord. And then again, it took Joseph becoming a prisoner of man to become a prisoner of the Lord. So in both of those situations, whenever we say, do we believe that God was with Joseph? And we say, well, maybe that was true in whenever he became a servant and whenever he became a prisoner, but what did it take? It took Joseph not just becoming a servant of man, but also a servant of the Lord. It took Joseph not just becoming a prisoner of man, but also becoming a prisoner of the Lord, to see how God was working in his life, so that Joseph was working for the Lord. And so, again, I want to ask, do we believe that God was with Joseph? And again, we're going to sit here and say, yes, of course we do. But do we believe that God is with us? And that's whenever we're like, well, yeah, God's with us. But do we believe that God was with us like he was with Joseph? That he can affect our lives, that he can affect the lives of those around us whenever we are at our lows, whenever we must be humbled in our prisons or in our servitude. In those types of things, do we believe that God is with us? And we're like, well, no, it's not the same. That was the Old Testament. Joseph was in the Old Testament. The Lord worked a little bit different back then. Things were different back then. But how about now? Does the Lord still work with us, in us, in the same places? Do you believe that God is with you whenever we are in our low places, just like God was with Joseph in his low places? Or do we simply believe that God is just watching over us, that he's created this world and he just spins it around every once in a while, and he just watches the world that he's created and lets everything happen? Or I think that we see God as just this bigger picture God who is not working with us. He has created us and he's done things for us, but he's not with us. In business school at Faulkner, we studied a couple different types of leaders and different leadership characteristics. And I believe that most people would say the best leaders are those who lead with and those who lead by example rather than just telling people, hey, go do this, go do that. And I think that that's simply because that's how Jesus led, right? So we say that the best leaders lead with their team and they lead by example. But for a leader not to do this, a leader to just say, well, yeah, here, I've prepared you, now go figure it out, as if that is our mind of how the Lord leads, which I'm not saying that at all. But if that is in our mind and how our thought process is thinking, then we just tend to see it as like a football coach coaching a team all week long. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, I'm going to practice, and then Friday, you guys got a game, but I'm not going to go, right? You guys just figure it out. Y'all know what to do. I prepared you. You know what to do, and we act like maybe that's how the Lord has prepared us. He's done the things that are set in stone. He's created this world. He's created us. He's given us what he wants us to do, but then beyond that, he just kind of lets us figure it out. No, I think that God is with us at that football game on Friday night. God is with us. Not literally at a football game, but as the coach analogy. But you get what I'm saying. But God is with us. God is not just preparing us. God is with us in our life. And we're going to dig into this a little bit further. God is always with you. In a time of fear, in a time of doubt, in a time of joy, the Lord is with you. In Matthew 1, verse 23, sorry, I just realized I made that pretty small. It says, behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel, which means God is with us. So Mary was told that God was with her. Let's see. Okay, we'll go on to this. Don't know if I want to chase a rabbit or not. So Mary was told that God was with her, and she had fear. Right? Whenever we're told in Matthew 1, verse 23, that Mary is going to have a son named Emmanuel, and it's going to mean God is with us. Well, Mary was told that God was with her, and she had fear. But the angel of the Lord told her, do not be afraid. In Luke chapter 1, verse 30, we see in Mary's interaction with the angel, of the angel saying, do not be afraid. But why? Why would she have fear? what's going on here? So Mary is obviously a teenager who's not married yet, but she's soon to be married, and she's being told that she's going to have a kid. Now imagine that, a teenager being said, hey, you're going to be a mom. Do you not think that there's instantly going to be fear in that moment? And then beyond that, beyond the fact that Mary's life is about to completely change, in her mind, she's got like the life of just like any teenager or any probably person is planning their life, saying, well, I'm going to get married to Joseph, and we're going to have one boy and one girl, which they probably would have way more, but how we're going to have a kid, and we're going to raise them up here, and we're going to do these things, and they're going to play baseball and soccer and all this stuff. And she had in mind what her life looked like, right? She had in mind what her life was looked like. And then there's this angel, which that's a whole other story. The fact that a person is communicating with an angel was probably terrifying enough for her to have fear. That's why the angel's like, don't be afraid, don't be scared. But she has this sense of fear, right? Because she's talking to an angel. The angel is telling her, hey, your life is about to be completely different than what you think it is. You're about to have the Son of God, and God is about to be with you. God is going to be with you. And so she has fear, right? But Mary was also told that God was with her, and she had doubt. When Mary asked the angel of the Lord in verse 34, she said, how will this be since I am a virgin? She simply is doubting the fact that, are you sure? Are you sure? Like, I don't think that you got the right person here. I don't think that this is for me. I don't think that this is what I want to be a part of. I'm not really sure what's going on. She has this natural sense of doubt, like because it's this supernatural event that is about to happen. And so she's simply going to doubt the angel. But then also, Mary was told that God was with her. And at the end of this, I believe she had joy. In verse 38, it says that Mary said to the angel of the Lord, behold, I am a servant of the Lord. I don't think that Mary's fear and her doubt just extinguished, but I think that she still had fear. She still had doubt. She was still scared of the fact that, well, I'm about to become a mom. She was still maybe doubting, like, I just don't know that this is really about to happen. Is this really about to be what my life is going to look like? But then I think that at the end of this, she had joy of, I can put my needs, my wants, the things that I need in my life aside. I can humble myself so that I can work for the Lord and that I can obey Him. And I think that is where that joy is created. And her humbling herself, saying, I want to live for the Lord and I want to be obedient to the Lord, and that's going to bring joy to my life because I'm bringing joy to God, right? So, God was telling Mary, or God was not telling Mary that He would be with her. What God was telling Mary is that He would be with Mary herself, that He would be with all the apostles, He would be with Joseph in this moment, He would be Joseph, the husband of Mary, He would be with you, He would be with you, He would be with you, He would be with every single person from this moment on, right? God was not just saying, well, God's going to be with you, Mary. No, that's not it. God was coming to earth to completely change the world, right? God is going to be with every single one of us from this moment forward, from the birth of Jesus Christ moving forward. John 1:1 says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And then in verse 14 it says, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And we have seen truth, His glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. God went from dwelling in a tabernacle, dwelling with the tabernacle in the Old Testament, to dwelling among us. And this is what the whole Old Testament was leading up to. Whenever Isaiah was prophesying what was said in Matthew 1, verse 23, all of this was leading up to the fact that there was going to be the Messiah coming to the world, and that God was not just going to dwell in this tabernacle. God was not just going to be this God that communicated to the prophets. God was going to be with us in the world. God was going to dwell among us. He was going to become, instead of just being this word that was talked about, He was going to become flesh and dwell among us and live with us. Again, that's leading with us. He is leading by example through us. And in 1 Corinthians 3, verse 16, it says, do you not know that you are God's temple and that God's Spirit dwells in you? Again, this is whenever everything is changing of the fact that God's temple is where God dwelt. But now God's temple dwells with us. Whenever he came and chose to dwell among us, and he came and chose to die for us, that's whenever God being with us is a completely different story that we're talking about. So do we doubt that God is with us? Just like Mary had doubt, right? Mary had doubt that, man, I'm not sure that I'm going to be able to bear a son. I'm not sure that I'm going to be able to have a kid, get along a kid from this angel that this angel's telling me about with God. I'm going to be able to have this kid and his name's going to be Emmanuel, which means God is with us. I'm not so sure about that. I'm doubting these things, right? And so we sit here and maybe we have this doubt that God is with us. We have this doubt and we say, well, I'm not sure if God is with me whenever I'm struggling. I'm not sure if God is with me whenever I'm in my prison. I'm not sure if God is with me whenever I'm a servant, a slave. Well, I'm not sure if God is with me whenever I'm struggling here, struggling there. And we sit here and we maybe have doubts of whenever God is with us. We're like, well, I could believe that God is with me while I'm doing this, but is God really with me whenever I just lost my job, whenever I just failed this test, whenever I just fill in the blank? Is God really with me? Or do we doubt God's presence in our life? Do we doubt God's ability of His presence in our life? Do we maybe fear God's presence? Just like Mary was fearful of the sense of the Lord is with the Lord is going to change my life. The Lord is I'm going to have a child, and I'm going to become a mother. My life is about to completely change. I was just going to get married to Joseph, and we were going to have kids in 5 years. No, like you're having a kid right now, then you'll get married to Joseph like afterwards, all right? And so we sit here, and Mary has this fear, but do we fear God's presence in the sense of God's presence is going to change our life, right? God's presence is supposed to change our life. Or are we sitting here saying, is having God's presence in my life going to change? Whenever we become a Christian and we say, well, God's presence is going to be in our life, is that going to require change? And does that create fear in our life of, wow, I don't know if I want to have God present in my life whenever I'm with those people. I'm not sure if I want to have God present in my life whenever I'm watching this show. I'm not sure if I want to have God present in my life whenever I'm going and doing this thing. Because what? We don't want to completely change our entire life, right? We fear the fact that God is going to be present in our life. I think that is maybe where that doubt also stems from, right? So we have this doubt because we have this fear, just like Mary did, right? But at the end of the day, what did Mary end up saying? She said, I am a servant of the Lord. So do we find joy in God's presence? Just like Mary ended up finding joy in the fact that she was going to have to change her life. She was going to have to maybe overcome those doubts by humbling herself. She was going to have to be obedient to the Lord by changing a few things that maybe her life had planned for her or envisioned in her mind. So she's going to have to change some things, and she's going to have to overcome that doubt, overcome that fear. We're going to have to overcome that doubt of God's presence and how God works in our life. How overcome that fear of God being a part of our lives so that we can find joy in our lives. Saying, I'm going to put aside my wants to glorify God and to see Him work in my life. I'm going to put aside the things that I care about so that I can focus and obey the things that God cares about. Each of these point in a direction that demands obedience and humility. Just like it did for Mary, just like it did for Joseph, doubt can be overcome by humbling ourselves to understand just how much God works in our life. Understanding that God works in every single piece in our life. To realize that came from God, not from me. That job that I have came from God, not from me. The house that I just bought came from God, not from me. And the education that I have, that came from God, not from me. This morning, the staff over at Scenic Hills was actually meeting with a fundraiser called Walk for Water. And it's a fundraiser that we were pursuing, possibly putting on in our future. And so Walk for Water is this program where they put on a fundraiser here in the States, and then that money goes and they build a well in a country where clean water is hard to come by. Very, very hard to come by, and they look at the statistics of those who die by the dirty water and all the things that are in their water. And so I say all that to say they're building these wells, and a lot of times they're building them right beside a Church of Christ building in Kenya or in Haiti or in wherever, fill in the blank. And they're putting these wells to have clean water. And as we were talking to him, the guy from Walk for Water, he was like, well, in Africa, and I know Haiti's not in Africa, but in Africa, they were saying that their view of God is a lot different than our view of God. And it's funny that he said this, and I was like, I'm actually talking about that tonight. But their view of God is that everything comes from God. Our view of God is, God has created us. God has given us this life. And as Christians, we acknowledge that. And as Christians, we see that, but we don't see that in every little detail and every little facet in our life. And he said, for an example, he said, now if it rains, which obviously it probably rains a lot less in Africa than it does here, because it's rained today, yesterday, the day before, the day before, the day before, and so on, So it literally rains every day here. But they say if it rains, they see that as something that God has sent them, God has blessed them with. And yeah, sure, maybe we're like, thank you for the rain, Lord, in our prayers and stuff like that. But do we really see that as something that God has blessed us with, that God has sent us with, and see God working in places like that? See God working in the things that God has blessed us with, like those people do. And obviously there it's probably a lot less seen by them, and also probably has to do with cultural differences and stuff like that. But regardless, seeing God in every little thing in life, that is how we humble ourselves to overcome that doubt. Now, fearing the Lord I think is a fair thing to say, right? But not saying I'm fearful to have the Lord in my life. And that's where I was trying to say if Mary was fearful of the Lord, maybe fearful of the angel that she was talking to, because her life was about to change, right? And so we don't want that kind of fear in our life. We don't want to be afraid of, man, I don't know if I can do this because I know God's watching me. But kind of in a scared sense, but in a respectful sense, right? Just like a lot of the Old Testament, whenever they said they feared God and they feared the Lord, that they had a respectful fear and understanding of the Lord's power, correct? And so this respectful fear of obeying the Lord and being faithful to Him, being obedient to Him and wanting to be obedient to Him, so that we can have this respectful fear and understanding of the Lord, right? So, and joy can be found by humbling ourselves and choosing to obey Him and living our life for Him. So God is saying that this life is not mine. This life is not one that is about me. Just like, again, remember Joseph early on, Joseph in Genesis. He was maybe prideful in the things that he had done. And his life was about him because, his dad kind of made it about him. And the things that he had were about him. And the dreams that he had were things that were glorifying him. And so we want to make things about us, and we think that's where we're going to find joy. Man, if I can do this, if I can have this in life, if I can be able to buy this house, this bigger house, if I can get this promotion, if I can buy this new car, if I can buy this new boat, this new whatever, this vacation, then I'm going to find joy, and that's where I'm going to find joy. But where did Joseph find his joy? Where did Mary find her joy? Whenever her life changed, but her life changed to live for the Lord, she had to humble herself and say, man, all these things that I want in life are maybe not what's best for me. What's best for me is that if I obey the Lord, right? I'm not saying your life is going to be perfect if we just obey the Lord and you're going to get everything you want and everything, but you are going to get everything that you need. The Lord is going to provide for us what we need, but we have to humble ourselves and obey the Lord and live our life for Him. So Joseph, again, was humbled by becoming a servant of Potiphar. But he was obedient to God, and the Lord was with him. And then Joseph, again, was humbled by being put in prison. But again, he was obedient to the Lord, or obedient to God, and the Lord was with him. And then Mary, she humbled herself by putting aside the needs and the priorities in her life so that she could become a servant of the Lord. So in all of these things, the Lord was working for these people. The Lord was working for the people who had put aside their own needs, who had humbled themselves and chosen to be obedient to God. A person who is sophomoric is someone who is overconfident of knowledge but poorly informed and immature. So in both high school and in college, your second year into high school and into college, you are a sophomore in high school or a sophomore in college. And at about that moment, whenever you have finish your first year and you become a sophomore, you are instantly diagnosed with what's called Sophomore Syndrome, which is whenever you think that you know every single thing that there is to know about college or every single thing that there is to know about high school. You know all the classes you need to take, you know all the clubs you need to be involved in, you know all the events that you need to go to, you know everything, right? And so you feel as though you have all the knowledge in the world and that you can share that to everyone. I spent 2 summers working on the Chattooga River up in South Carolina as a whitewater rafting guide. And even people there, with a bunch of people who never saw their sophomore year of college or high school for that matter, we still had the same thing called second year syndrome, which was your second year on the river. You thought that you knew it all, right? You thought that you knew every single thing there was. You knew how to guide down this rapid. You knew how to go down this fall. You knew that if this went wrong, how to recover from this. And so with 1 year under your belt, you thought that you could tell everyone what to do, right? And there's people working there who had been there for 20 years. They had guided in New Zealand. They had guided in Costa Rica. They had guided in Alaska. They truly knew it all, but you would have thought that the guy with 1 year experience knew more than this guy just by how they're talking. We all know that guy, right? And so we always said that Mama Chattooga, the river, always has a way of showing who's boss. And the way she showed you was a whole lot worse than a whooping from your mama. She flipped you. She made you look like a fool in front of every single guest. And, you know, sometimes big flipping meant big tipping, but sometimes it didn't. Sometimes guests were mad. And sometimes they were not happy that they came out of the boat and they went swimming. And so, well, that being said, is that their overconfidence and the things that they thought that they were good at really showed them who was boss. They were really humbled by the fact they thought, I knew everything. But what? The river showed them differently, right? We're often humbled by our failures whenever we become overconfident in our own abilities. For a Christian to be humbled, it requires serving God instead of serving ourselves. Serving ourselves has failed us, but serving God will reward us. I'll say that again. Serving ourselves has failed us whenever people have this selfish of, I want to get this. I want to get to this part in life. I want to have more and more and more money, more and more success, more and more fame, whatever it was. All that leads to is failure over and over again of, I'm not satisfied. I want more, and I want more. That's all people want is more. But whenever they serve God and they say, instead of making this life about me, instead of saying me about everything and looking at God towards everything, then that's whenever we will be rewarded. And in the long run, we are going to be far more rewarded by our servitude towards the Lord and towards God. In Philippians 2, verse 3 through 11, I know this is kind of a chunk, but this is where Jesus shows us humility, and we can see the Lord's humility in this. So I want to read this passage, so bear with me, please. Do nothing from self-ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look not only to his own interest, but also to the interests of others. Having this in mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men, and being found in human form. He humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Therefore God has highly exalted him and bestowed on the name that is above every name, so that at the name of Jesus every knee shall bow, in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Jesus, we know, was with the Lord in heaven, and he humbled himself to come to this world. Imagine that. I mean, that's like moving to Florida to Kansas or something. I don't know. That's like moving from the best place to the worst place, right? No offense if you're from Kansas. But Jesus humbled himself to come to this world. He left heaven to come to this world. And then not just that, he came to this world, which is probably bad enough coming from heaven, but his obedience of the Lord led him to die for us, right? His obedience led him to die for us to the point of death, even death on a cross. But now what? Will we humble ourselves to bow on our knees, to focus on the things that the Lord has done for us, to serve him? And will we boldly proclaim and confess his name with our tongues and confess his name and his gospel for his sake by humbling ourselves so that we can obey the Lord, right? This is in Michelangelo's painting of the creation of Adam, and it's in the Sistine Chapel, and this painting probably takes up like that much space of it, literally an entire ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, which is incredibly massive. But there's this painting where God's hand on the right is reaching towards Adam's hand on the left. And so the hand of God is reaching out to the hand of Adam, and the hand of Adam is to symbolize man reaching back towards God. But you see that there's this little space between their hands. And that space must be filled for us to take God's hand, for us to be able to take God's hand, to have God with us, to have God a part of our lives. But that space can only be filled by a perfect sacrifice that showed us the perfect example of obedience and of humility. Jesus, obviously, is the one who humbled himself to come to this world and then obeyed the Lord and died for us. And so now what? Are we going to fill that gap, to hold on to God's hand, to make God a part of our lives? So if you need to take hold of the hand of Jesus, take hold of the hand of God, and begin your walk with Him as a part of your life, then that journey must be started by being baptized. That's what the Lord came here to do, is to add us to His body so that He can be with us and that we can hold on to Him and walk with the Lord, to wash away our old self and begin a new life with Jesus as the one that you live for. Or if it's just that you need prayers of the church because maybe you've loosened up of your grip onto God's unchanging hand, or if there's anything else that we can do for you, then I pray that you come forward as together we stand and as we sing.